Ma'am, I asked you to step back.
I'm authorized to be here.
You're not following instructions.
I am. I just need you to read this.
That doesn't change anything.
It's my DOJ ID.
Anyone can print a card.
Please call it in.
You're making this harder than it needs to be.
I'm trying to prevent a mistake.
We don't need to.
I'm a senior litigator with the department.
The interaction is taking place in a public parking structure attached to a federal office complex. It is mid-morning on a weekday. Employees move in and out in steady intervals. Security patrols the area as part of a routine presence, checking permits and responding to minor calls from building management. The woman had parked in a space reserved for federal staff. Her vehicle was properly registered in the system, but the tag was not immediately visible from the officer's angle. The officer had been asked to verify a report of an unauthorized vehicle. These checks happen often. Most are resolved in minutes. When the officer approached, the woman was gathering her materials and preparing to enter the building. She did not rush. She did not attempt to leave. She answered questions directly. Her responses were precise, using language common in professional settings but unfamiliar in routine enforcement exchanges. The officer interpreted that precision as avoidance. From the beginning, the situation was framed as noncompliance rather than clarification. The officer repeated instructions designed for someone assumed to be ignoring authority. The woman responded as someone accustomed to formal verification processes. Each side believed they were being clear. The identification she presented was valid. It was issued by the Department of Justice and listed her position and credentials. However, the officer did not attempt to verify it immediately. In similar encounters, officers often rely on visual cues and past experience before escalating to database checks. That judgment call is informal but common. The environment contributed to the delay. Radios crackled with unrelated traffic. Vehicles passed through the structure. Other officers were handling separate matters nearby. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. What was happening instead was procedural drift. The officer continued the interaction under the assumption that the woman was a civilian disputing a minor enforcement action. The woman continued under the assumption that her credentials would be reviewed once presented. Neither assumption was corrected in time. The officer's questions became narrower, focused on compliance rather than verification. The woman's answers stayed consistent, but each clarification was treated as resistance. No one raised their voice. No physical action was taken. The tone remained controlled, but the gap between authority and accuracy widened. This was not an unusual setting for misunderstanding. Parking structures, lobbies, and security checkpoints are designed for efficiency. They rely on quick judgments and routine compliance. When someone does not fit the expected pattern, those systems slow down. The officer had not yet run the identification through dispatch. The woman had not yet been allowed to contact her office. The interaction stayed suspended in that space between certainty and confirmation. At this point, nothing irreversible had happened, but the longer the verification was delayed, the harder it became to reset the encounter. Each minute reinforced the officer's initial assumption. Each minute increased the risk that a routine check would be formally documented as an incident. What neither side said out loud was already becoming clear. The situation was no longer about a parking violation. It was about whose version of authority would be recognized first. The misunderstanding was still quiet, but it was no longer minor. The woman works as a senior litigator for the Department of Justice. Her role involves managing complex federal cases, coordinating with multiple agencies, and appearing regularly in court. Much of her work is procedural, reviewing filings, advising investigators, and ensuring that enforcement actions align with federal standards. It is a position that requires accuracy, restraint, and familiarity with authority structures. She has held the role for more than a decade. Before that, she served in other federal legal offices, moving gradually into higher responsibility assignments. Her career path is steady rather than fast. Supervisors describe her as reliable and difficult to rattle. She is known for preparing thoroughly and speaking carefully, especially in situations involving enforcement or compliance. Colleagues say she avoids unnecessary confrontation. In meetings, she listens more than she speaks. When she does speak, her language is formal and exact. That habit comes from years of writing motions and responding to judges, where wording matters and tone is scrutinized. Outside of work, she keeps a low profile. She does not seek attention, and she rarely discusses her cases in personal settings. Her authority at work is well established. Law enforcement agencies regularly defer to her office on legal questions. Junior attorneys consult her before making recommendations. When she arrives at a facility or meeting, her presence is expected and documented. She carries identification not as a symbol but as a requirement. There has been one prior incident, years earlier, that colleagues still mention in passing. During a multi-agency briefing, she was mistaken for support staff and asked to retrieve documents for the meeting. She corrected the assumption without comment and proceeded with her presentation. The moment did not escalate and no complaint was filed. It was noted only because of how routine it felt. That experience did not alter her behavior. She did not change how she introduced herself or how she spoke in professional spaces. She continued to assume that credentials, once shown, would be sufficient. In her work, verification is a standard step. Questions are resolved through documentation, not confrontation. On the day of the incident, she was following her usual routine. She was scheduled to be in the building for meetings related to an ongoing matter. Her arrival time, vehicle registration, and access permissions had all been submitted in advance. Nothing about the day stood out as unusual. She was dressed as she typically is for work, professionally, without emphasis. She carried a work bag containing files and a government-issued badge. Her phone held contact information for colleagues inside the building, including supervisors and security liaisons. In her experience, interactions with security or police at federal facilities are brief. Identification is checked. Names are confirmed. People move on. She had no reason to expect the exchange in the parking structure to extend beyond that pattern. When the officer questioned her presence, she responded as she would in any professional context. She explained her purpose. She offered identification. She asked for verification. These were routine steps in her world. What she did not anticipate was that her familiarity with procedure would be interpreted differently. The calmness that served her in courtrooms did not signal cooperation in this setting. The precision that protected her in legal filings did not translate as clarity on the ground. By the time the interaction moved beyond a simple check, she was already operating from a professional assumption that the issue would be resolved once the correct information was reviewed. That assumption had guided her behavior for years. It had never been tested this way. The day begins without urgency. The woman leaves her home with enough time to account for traffic and parking. She arrives at the federal complex shortly before her first meeting. The parking structure is partially full, with cars entering and exiting at a steady pace. Engines idle, doors close, footsteps echo briefly and then disappear. She parks in a space designated for federal employees and authorized visitors. The space is one she has used before. The permit is registered to her vehicle, though the placard is not immediately visible from every angle. She shuts off the engine, checks her phone, and gathers her bag. As she steps out of the car, a patrol vehicle enters the structure from the opposite end. The officer inside is moving slowly, scanning license plates and spaces. This is part of a routine sweep requested by building management earlier that morning after an unrelated complaint about unauthorized parking. The officer notices her vehicle and stops nearby. He exits the patrol car and approaches. His posture is neutral. His tone, at first, is procedural. He asks if the vehicle belongs to her. She says that it does. He asks whether she is authorized to park there. She answers that she is and explains that she works in the building. She reaches into her bag to retrieve her identification. The movement is unhurried. She does not announce what she is doing. The officer tells her to stop and asks what she is reaching for. She pauses and explains that she is getting her badge. He nods and allows her to continue. She hands him the identification and waits. The officer looks at the card briefly. He does not read it in full. He asks her again why she is parked in the space. She repeats that she is a DOJ employee and that the vehicle is registered. She suggests that he can verify it through the system. At this point, the interaction extends beyond what she expects. In similar situations, the exchange ends once identification is shown. Instead, the officer asks her to step away from the vehicle. She complies. He positions himself closer to the driver's side door. A car passes behind them, its headlights briefly illuminating the space. The sound of tires on concrete fills the pause. The officer returns the badge but does not comment on it. He asks her for a second form of identification. She asks why it is needed given the badge. Her question is calm and measured. The officer responds by repeating the request. She provides a government-issued ID from her wallet. The officer examines this one longer. He compares the names. He looks at the vehicle again. He asks her where exactly she works in the building. She gives the office name and floor number. She offers to call a colleague who can confirm her presence. The officer says that won't be necessary. What changes the tone is small. When she explains that her meeting is scheduled to start soon, the officer interprets it as pressure. He tells her she needs to wait. She agrees and says she understands. She asks how long the verification will take. He does not answer directly. Instead, he asks her to explain again why she is there. The repetition signals a shift. The questions are no longer about confirmation but about consistency. Her answers do not change. She stays in the same spot, hands visible, voice steady. The officer steps away to his vehicle briefly, then returns without having used the radio. He asks her if she understands that parking without authorization can result in citation or removal. She says she understands and repeats that she is authorized. A maintenance worker walks past, pushing a cart. He glances at the scene and keeps moving. The interaction remains contained. No one stops. The officer tells her that she appears to be refusing to comply with instructions. She responds that she has complied with every request and asks which instruction she has not followed. He does not specify. He tells her again to wait. At this point, she notices the time. Her meeting is approaching. She considers calling her office but hesitates, expecting the officer to initiate verification. She has learned over years of interagency work that stepping outside the immediate chain can complicate matters. She chooses to stay. The officer's questions narrow further. He asks whether she understands that presenting false identification is a serious matter. She says that the identification is real and issued by her employer. She asks again if he will verify it. He says he will, but not yet. The delay is not dramatic. Minutes pass quietly. The officer remains close. She remains still. The space between them is professional but firm. No one raises their voice. No one moves abruptly. What has begun to form, though, is a shared awareness that the interaction is no longer routine. The officer is committed to his initial framing. The woman is waiting for a procedural step that has not come. Neither says it out loud, but both recognize that something has shifted. The longer they stand there, the harder it will be to reset the exchange back to what it was supposed to be. This is the point where a simple check becomes an incident. The officer tells her again that she needs to follow instructions. His tone is steady, but the phrasing has changed. It is no longer framed as a request. It is presented as a warning. She nods and says she understands. She asks, again, what instruction she has not followed. He does not answer the question directly. Instead, he says she is being argumentative. She responds that she is trying to clarify the situation. She reminds him that she has given her identification and that verification would resolve the issue. The officer repeats that she needs to wait. She stays where she is. He asks her to explain why she did not immediately comply when first approached. She says she believed she was complying. She explains that she reached for her badge because that is standard in federal facilities. He says she should have asked first. She says she did once he questioned the movement. The exchange loops. A second vehicle enters the structure and parks several spaces away. A man steps out, glances over, and slows briefly. He does not stop. The officer notices and positions himself slightly closer to the woman, as if to signal control of the interaction. The officer tells her that her tone suggests she does not respect his authority. She pauses before responding. She says that she respects law enforcement and that she is simply asking for verification. Her voice does not rise. She does not gesture. He says that if she continues to argue, the situation will escalate. She says she does not want that and asks what she can do to resolve it. He tells her to remain silent and wait. The instruction lands differently than the others. Until now, she has been answering questions. Being told not to speak reframes the interaction. She looks at him and says that remaining silent will not help confirm her identity. He says it is not her decision. She stops talking. The officer steps away again, checks his phone, then returns. He still has not contacted dispatch. He tells her that her identification could be fraudulent. She says that it can be verified through DOJ channels and offers the number for her office. He says he does not need it. Another employee walks past, badge visible, and hesitates briefly before continuing. The woman notices. She feels the shift from private inconvenience to public scrutiny. No one is openly watching, but she is aware of being seen. The officer tells her that refusal to cooperate can lead to further action. She says she is cooperating. He says cooperation does not include questioning him. She says she is not questioning him, only asking for the process to move forward. For the first time, there is a pause where neither speaks. The officer looks at her identification again. He asks her to state her full name and date of birth. She does. He asks her employer. She answers. He asks her job title. She gives it. He reacts slightly, then recovers. He says titles do not matter in this situation. She says nothing. The officer tells her that if she is lying, the consequences will be serious. The statement is delivered flatly, without threat. It is still enough to register. She feels briefly the possibility that the interaction could move beyond delay into formal accusation. That moment passes, but it leaves its mark. Her posture stiffens. She keeps her hands visible. She thinks about calling her supervisor, but does not. She is still waiting for the officer to do what she expects him to do. The officer turns and speaks into his radio for the first time. The transmission is short. He requests a supervisor to respond to his location for a possible compliance issue. He does not mention the DOJ identification. She hears the call. She asks whether the supervisor will be able to verify her credentials. He says that will be decided when they arrive. The phrasing suggests that verification is no longer the central issue. Control is. A few minutes later, another patrol car enters the structure. It parks several spaces away. The second officer remains inside, waiting. There is no urgency, no lights, no sirens. The presence alone changes the dynamic. The first officer tells her that she is being detained for disorderly conduct related to refusal to comply. The words are stated calmly. She asks what conduct he is referring to. He says she will have a chance to explain later. She says she would like to speak now, while the misunderstanding can still be corrected. He says the supervisor will handle it. This is the moment where fear appears briefly and quietly. Not panic, not shock. The realization that the process she trusted is no longer guiding the interaction. She takes a breath and says one thing, that she is a senior litigator with the Department of Justice and that this will be confirmed. She says it without emphasis. The officer does not respond. They wait. The supervisor arrives several minutes later. He parks close enough to see the two of them without stepping out of his vehicle immediately. He watches through the windshield as the first officer speaks briefly, gesturing toward the woman and then toward the car. When the supervisor exits, he approaches at a measured pace. He asks the officer what the issue is. The officer says the woman is refusing to comply during a parking enforcement check and may have provided false identification. The supervisor looks at the woman and asks for her name. She gives it. He asks her employer. She says the Department of Justice. He asks for identification. She hands him the same badge and ID she had already provided. He looks at them carefully. He reads them in full. He turns the badge over and checks the expiration date. He does not comment. He asks the officer whether the identification has been run. The officer says it has not yet been verified. The supervisor pauses, then asks why. The officer says the woman was argumentative and that he wanted to maintain control of the scene. The supervisor steps a few feet away and uses his radio. He gives the name and badge number. He asks for confirmation through federal channels. The exchange is quiet. The woman stands where she has been standing. No one tells her to move. While waiting, the supervisor asks her what she is doing at the facility. She explains her meetings and the office she is visiting. She provides names. The supervisor nods and writes them down. The radio responds. The confirmation is brief. The identification is valid. The employment status is current. The access permissions are on file. The supervisor thanks dispatch and ends the call. He looks at the officer. The officer's posture changes slightly. His shoulders drop. He avoids eye contact for a moment. The supervisor asks the officer to step aside. They speak quietly out of earshot. The woman remains where she is. The second patrol car stays parked. No one else approaches. After a short conversation, the supervisor returns. He tells the woman that there has been a misunderstanding and that she is not being detained. He says she is free to go to her meeting. His tone is formal. He does not apologize. He does not explain further. She asks whether the disorderly conduct designation will be documented. He says it will not proceed. She asks whether the interaction will be reviewed. He says that is standard procedure when a supervisor is called. She nods. The officer does not speak. He stands a few steps back, hands resting at his sides. The supervisor hands her back her identification, though she is already holding it. She asks one final question, whether she will receive a report number or contact information for follow-up. The supervisor gives her a card with his name and unit number. He tells her she can reference the date and time. The interaction ends without ceremony. The supervisor returns to his vehicle. The second patrol car leaves. The first officer remains for a moment, then walks back to his. She gathers her bag and walks toward the elevator. Her meeting has already started. She sends a brief message to her office that she will be delayed. As the doors close, the space behind her returns to its usual rhythm. Cars move in and out. Footsteps echo and fade. The incident leaves no visible trace. For the officer, the correction is immediate and contained. The facts are clear now. The identification he dismissed was valid. The authority he questioned was real. The realization does not unfold dramatically. It settles in quietly through radio confirmation and a supervisor's look. The mistake has been made plain without being announced. What follows will not happen in the parking structure. Later that day, the supervisor files a routine report noting the call, the detention, and the verification. The report includes timestamps, locations, and the stated reason for escalation. It also notes that the disorderly conduct designation was not pursued. The officer is instructed to submit his own written account before the end of the shift. Within 48 hours, the department opens an internal review. This is standard when a supervisor intervenes in a detention that does not result in charges. Body camera footage is requested. Radio logs are pulled. The review is administrative, not criminal. The officer is placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. His patrol duties are reassigned. He is notified in writing and told not to discuss the incident outside of official channels. No public statement is made at this stage. The woman reports the incident through her agency's internal process the following morning. She submits a factual summary and attaches copies of her identification. She does not request specific disciplinary action. She asks only that the interaction be reviewed and documented. The Department of Justice contacts the police department through formal liaison channels. The communication is brief and procedural. It requests confirmation of the review and preservation of all records related to the incident. There is no public comment from DOJ leadership. Within a week, the incident becomes public through a local records request. Media outlets report that a senior DOJ attorney was detained for disorderly conduct during a parking enforcement interaction. Articles rely on official statements and verified timelines. Headlines are restrained. There is no video released immediately. Public response is measured. Legal professionals comment on the procedural failures. Civil rights organizations request further details. The police department confirms that an internal investigation is ongoing and that training protocols are being examined. Several weeks later, the department announces the outcome. The officer receives a suspension and is required to complete additional training focused on identification, verification, and escalation procedures. The department states that the incident did not meet the threshold for termination, but did reveal gaps in practice. Policy updates follow. Officers are reminded in writing that government-issued identification must be verified before escalation. Supervisors are instructed to be contacted earlier when federal credentials are presented. The changes are circulated internally. The woman does not give interviews. She returns to her normal workload. She attends meetings, files briefs, and appears in court. The incident is referenced only when necessary, usually in procedural discussions or training examples. There is no lawsuit filed. There is no settlement announced. The resolution remains administrative. What lingers is not the detention itself, but the record of how easily it occurred. In reports and memos, the interaction is reduced to steps and decisions. Each choice is documented. Each delay is noted. The aftermath is quiet. It unfolds through paperwork, policy language, and internal review meetings. The consequences are real but contained. The parking structure remains unchanged. Situations like this are rarely the result of a single decision. They develop through a sequence of small judgments made under routine conditions. In this case, the initial assumption shaped every step that followed. Once the interaction was framed as noncompliance, evidence that contradicted that frame was treated as secondary. Bias in these moments does not require hostility. It operates through expectations about who belongs in certain spaces and how authority is usually displayed. When someone does not match those expectations, systems built for efficiency can default to control instead of verification. Law enforcement procedures rely heavily on discretion. Officers are trained to assess situations quickly, often based on pattern recognition. That skill is useful, but it carries risk. Patterns simplify reality. When they are wrong, correction must come early. Delays make escalation more likely. This incident shows how professional language and calm behavior can be misinterpreted outside of familiar contexts. What reads as cooperation in one system can be read as resistance in another. Without a clear trigger to pause and confirm facts, misunderstandings harden. The presence of valid identification should have redirected the interaction. Instead, it became another point of suspicion. That shift reveals how authority is sometimes recognized only after it is validated by the system itself, not by the person presenting it. Structural safeguards exist to prevent these outcomes. Verification protocols, supervisory checks, and interagency communication are designed to interrupt faulty assumptions. When they are not used promptly, they lose their protective value. The consequences in this case were limited, but the process exposed a vulnerability. If a senior federal attorney can be detained during a routine workday, the same mechanisms can affect anyone whose identity is questioned. The lesson is procedural, not personal. Assumptions should trigger verification, not escalation. Authority should be checked, not challenged through delay. Understanding this distinction is essential for systems that rely on trust, speed, and accountability. If you've experienced or witnessed a situation where a small misunderstanding turned into something larger, your perspective matters. These moments often feel routine while they're happening, and significant only in hindsight. You can share your thoughts on how verification should work in everyday enforcement encounters, or where you think the process broke down in this case. If you work in law enforcement, government, or security, your insight into how these systems operate is especially relevant. Conversations like this help clarify where procedures succeed and where they fail. They also highlight how ordinary interactions can carry unexpected consequences. If you want to see more investigative stories built from real-world events and documented processes, you can follow or subscribe. The goal is to examine how systems function, not just when they fail, but when small decisions quietly change outcomes. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to think through the details.